Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Virtual Photographic Gallery. Thank you for joining us today for the third of the series, Decolonize the Lens. This is a four-part series of discursive events with photographic experts and scholars who will look at the local history of photography in Egypt and Northeast Africa to consider ways to decolonize the imperial gaze. In each of the four-part series, one of the program's guest speaker has presented or will present a different approach to rethinking the dominant narratives in the history of photography. Decolonize the Lens is a joint research project between faculty in journalism and mass communication, the history department, and the photographic gallery. If you've missed the first two webinars, you can watch the recordings, which are available now on the gallery's YouTube channel, and which I will post a link to in the chat box. And before we start today's presentation and discussion, I'll briefly introduce the photographic gallery and my collaborators, Dr. Ronnie Close and Dr. Mark Dietz, who alternate moderating the sessions throughout the series, and our guest speaker, Heba Farid. The photographic gallery was founded in 1991 as part of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And it is located in the New Cairo campus of the university and offers a public program of exhibitions, educational projects, workshops, and talks around the academic year. It showcases photography works by local and international, young, emerging, and established artists and students. Ronnie Close is an associate professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at the American University in Cairo. His research interests look at the relationship between aesthetics and politics, and he has worked on a long-term project on the ultras football movement in Egypt, Brazil, and Palestine. Through visual research projects, workshops, and written publications, he looks at the role of the image object in the contemporary world. Mark Dietz is assistant professor of African and world history at the AUC. He is a social and cultural historian of modern Africa with a research focus on the Senegambian region of West Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. His research emerges from his diplomatic experience in Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and Cape Verde. His current book project, based on the 2017 dissertation at Cornell University, is a socio-cultural history of the Casamance conflict in southern Senegal, tentatively entitled A Country of Defiance, Mapping the Casamance in Senegal. Mark's work has been published in History in Africa, the Journal of Asian and African Studies, the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of American History, and the blog site Africa is a Country. Today's guest speaker, Heba Farid, is an artist, curator, researcher, and educator in photography. She's based in Cairo. She was a co-founder of Contemporary Image Collective, the CIC, in 2004, and worked at the CULTNAT Bibliotheca Alexandrina Heritage Program from 2008 to 2016. She co-founded TINTERA, Cairo's first commercial gallery dedicated to photography, along with her partner Zain Khalifa. The gallery aims to raise the profile of both contemporary and historical photography in and of Egypt through curated exhibitions, events, and research projects. And she's professor of photography in the Visual Arts program at AUC since 2013. Before we start, I'd like to thank the American University in Cairo for funding this program. And I'll give you an idea about the format we will be using today. Since we're using the webinar format, you will only be seeing the co-hosts on your screen, and we will not be using the raise hand feature, but you can still make comments and ask questions via the chat box throughout Heba's talk, which is approximately 30 minutes long. And Mark and I will collect your questions for Ronnie to pose to Heba after the talk. Then Heba can address the most popular ones since time is limited. So let's get started. Ronnie, over to you.
Okay, I have to remember to unmute myself. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for this wonderful discussion with Heba Farid. as Dina was saying, she's an artist and also coming at it from a producer's perspective, which I think is an interesting contrast to our presentation last week, where we had a historian perspective on vernacular photography. And today, Heba will be dealing with photographic art practices and more, and also some commercial applications of photography through the photographic history of Egypt. So without any further ado, Heba, I'll invite you at Fidali to make your presentation, show some of the wonderful images you've gathered.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to present in this format. I haven't done this before, and it was definitely a challenge to keep it down to the time limit and still give an impression of what's happening and what has happened. So I'll start the screen share and then we'll get going. Okay, so even though we're looking at contemporary photographic practices in Egypt today, we should have a quick look at a few historical examples that artists draw from and respond to, then move on to the contemporary works. So I will focus only on portraiture or figurative works in this talk in order to get a bird's eye view of what is happening today. I've chosen to present a way of looking at these representational works as an image of the self, perhaps, and the material forms that they take in order to allude to some of the more known variables and interconnectedness that makes the work possible. There's no specific chronological order, nor is there a comprehensive list of photographers and artists. In fact, many have been left out. The examples I show will contain all nationalities, variety of backgrounds and engagements with the medium, and also a variety of approaches to the subject. My approach is always from the perspective of the producer, why and how these works were produced, who is the audience, and where we can find them. So I'm interested in the making and presenting of this work within the art context. I'm looking at some of the intentions and underlying mechanisms of these artworks, and I'm also concerned with their material nature. After all, photographs are objects and are loaded with meaning as such. So the first slide, Arnaud and Zangaki, over the past 40 years or more, there has been a lot of scholarship on these types of Orientalist works. They've been documented and deconstructed, and we have a clearer picture of how and why these works were produced. We also know that the photographers were connected to each other. Many of them were trained artists. They shared knowledge and resources. They were also competitors, and all were embedded in the commercial aspects of the profession as businesses. Today, we recognize the constructed and purposeful elements of these images, most of which have been collected privately and can be seen in the art market or reside in European museums. Since Egypt does not have a museum dedicated to photography, local publics do not have the opportunity to see these works. However, they still exist undiscovered in private family collections such as these, but it's rare that they can receive any attention needed for either their documentation or even preservation. But even though we may be oversaturated with these types of images, they still give us an idea of their prevalence, that they still hold currency today. But there are also more direct and candid images that exist where we can get a different picture of how photographers lived and worked in Egypt, engaging with locals in everyday life, not just their commercial intentions. So here I have to mention the local Egyptian photographer Atiyah Gaddis in Luxor, coined as Egypt's native son by his heirs and collection keepers. They have inherited equipment. He has inherited equipment from his mentor, Antonio Beato, and as such, he was able to start a studio in 1907. Since importing for Egyptians was complicated, which is possibly one reason why we don't see local studios opening up earlier. So his business went through several transitions, but still survives today, being the longest running photographic business in Egypt, and anyone can buy his photographs of monuments and sites that were so popular at the turn of the century at the shop. But what the public doesn't see is his photographs of the local people of Luxor, his regular clients, the fallahin, the school children, the priests, and families. All of his production is in the hands of his customers. These images here have been digitally produced from scan negatives, for example. What we see is contrary to the stage studio work so popular with city people. Here we see an intense presence, as if these sitters are present with us right now. If we look at the timeline of photographic practice in Egypt, we can trace the appearance of Gaddis' studio at the beginning stages of the first explosion of local studios operated by Egyptian photographers at the turn of the century. Aside from studio practice that requires many components to exist, there has been a consistent presence of itinerant photographers at beaches, especially in the Alexandria area, in addition to the known historical sites and tourist destinations like Luxor and Giza. At the beach, Egyptian families and social groups and their keen engagement with photography can only be traced by locating the examples in private family collections. The beach photographers are organized, syndicated, uniformed, and connected to other studios in the city where they produce the photographs that they just shot and sell them back to their clients. So even though photographers provide a commercial service, which is the main activity ensuring their livelihood, many photographers consider themselves artists and pursued other avenues for exposing their work and promoting their style. Here in these photographs, these are Garo organizing his own exhibition, probably at odds with a volatile, reactionary art scene in Cairo at the time. Here we can see images of celebrities from cinema depicting the sought-after aesthetics popular with the fashionable public. So a lot more work needs to be done regarding the connections to photographic practice at this time to the more modern art discussions that were happening locally among other artists. To recap, we have seen a continuum of Orientalist images to more candid and direct images of regular people in the countryside and small towns and at the beach, and to the glamorous images of the stars. And here with this work, we see images of a cosmopolitan nature of Cairo residents. The appearance of Studio Salim Yusuf also highlights a second wave of Egyptian-run studios in the mid-1920s. But Yusuf himself is enigmatic. We have very little information about him. At this time, studios were catering to the needs of an expanding urban client. And so with this added competition, some photographers were now distinguishing themselves as photographic artists, where each had their own recognizable style and signature. And certainly Salim Yusuf is one of those great examples. So how much do we know about photographers' engagement with the developments of art in this period? We still need to think about that and research it more. But a good example of modern photographic artist is Alban. He's the only to publish a memoir about his life and career, detailing the relationships and anecdotes inside the scene and how he developed his own art practice, balancing between client and personal work, creating a certain atmosphere or lifestyle. His widow, Shakay, eventually taking over not only the business, but also the diva-like rapport with clients. Alban was not alone at this time, but he was on the periphery of what we know about modern art discussions. Here, one published example from members of the Art and Freedom group, Art Revolutionaries, rooted in Egypt, but also linked with global avant-garde art movements. One of the more widely seen photographers is Van Leo. He really brought to fruition the atmosphere of the photographe artiste in his studio, continuing to produce high quality images well into the 1990s. Here we get a sneak preview of what it's like to be photographed by him in his studio and to be greeted by him in his reception. Although known for his iconic images, it's also his earlier personal work that has been of high interest more recently, as the material has been preserved, exhibited, published, and is open to scholarship and discussion. Unlike other artistic studios, access to Van Leeuw's professional achievements, essentially the work themselves, and the fact that he lived up to our contemporary period, we can say that he has directly influenced the work of other younger contemporary photographers and artists. Although Antro's style may not have been as extravagant as Van Leeuw, he still had fun and produced personal work. Here, Antro pretends to take a light meter reading, but simultaneously and as clandestine as possible, he releases the shutter and captures himself with his sitter unaware. These playful self-portraits were a systematic strategy of his. Since the early 1980s, studio photography of everyday people, as well as the more glamorous and cinematic image, have been massively collected. What was of little interest at that time and may prove more intriguing now are the local neighborhood studios, at service to and limited by their local community and fashions. These photographers also attempted to define and propagate their styles and techniques individually and in their own terms within the limitations of their exposure to localized popular styles of the time. These are also more recent references from which the contemporary practitioner draws from and responds to. So that's kind of what I'm wrapping up with, sort of a brief historical example, and now we'll talk about the contemporary works. And so I'll start by saying that over the last 25 years, we can see a recognizable aesthetic and underlying mechanisms and concerns with the bodies of work of at least two artists that I'll be talking about here at the beginning. The first one, and not in order of importance, is the work of Yusuf Nabil, an example of the kind of art photography that has taken center stage and gained massive commercial success in the art world, precisely drawing from his relationship with the work of Van Leeuw and Van Leeuw himself in terms of style and technique. Here, one photograph started his career in the late 90s, and the other is more recent work. His choice of props and poses, costumes and coloring echoes the work of his mentor and other of his mentor's contemporaries, and is often in direct engagement with cinema. The second artist and photographer, perhaps coming from a longer career spanning almost 50 years, Iverson not only worked for Van Leeuw, printing his work later in life, but also became intimately familiar with his colorist, who found further employment with him. He's also an example of a working press photographer who succeeded to carve out and protect his own creative space against the background of paid commissions and assignments, producing work over a continuum of time. His long dedication to the photographic practice has also other dimensions. Iverson amassed a large collection of historical and modern photography and has written on photography in Egypt and his relationship with Van Leeuw, and was instrumental in the succession and preservation of Van Leeuw's work after his passing. Here in this body of work entitled The Tour, Iverson creates a montage from his own work from his archive and portraits from his collection, coming to terms with his place within a photography from Egypt as photographer and collector simultaneously, and challenges the audience to try to remember or discern fact from fiction and reconnect with the notion of heritage, both photographic and sociocultural. This mechanism also works with a non-Egyptian audience because although it may mimic Orientalist aesthetics, it also provides an antidote to it through the reading of the work. Osama Said, coming from an art background and familiar with many industrial processes used to make printed, painted, and photographic artwork, Said drove deeply into 19th century photographic practices, taught private workshops to local photographic artists, and worked to help preserve the archive of another important local photographic business, Leonard and Landrog. He also works in other parts of the region, applying the same 19th century techniques from his repertoire, consistently engaging with the site and the presence or absence of its visual and photographic heritage. Bernard Guillot, a painter and photographer with long-standing presence and practice in Egypt, is more interested in the metaphysical and poetic associations to place, time, and state of consciousness. With a seemingly endless body and continuous amount of work, there is something very local that he expresses, existentialist and mythical at the same time, with his approach to places and spaces, the felt and the imagined. Although having exhibited in places and like Paris and New York, seeing his work on display in Cairo supports its reading in unexpected ways, which has led to an increased interest in his work. From the diaspora, Suzanne Hafuna, also from visual and media art background, works on identity and belonging in her self-portraits, often going to her familiar Delta village or investigating the artisan workshops around Cairo, imagining and making photographs that have a visceral and yet transportative quality. Hafuna's work has been exhibited and collected widely, and among other women artists and photographers from Egypt, has been published and is referenced often when looking for Egyptian work. One of a new generation of visual artists, also coming from an art education, Heba Khalifa's work is highly personal. Although other Western photographers may have engaged with local women in a variety of photographic, personal, and political projects, Khalifa digs deeper in the psychological space of thoughts and emotions. Here she works with anonymous women that she met through social media, inviting them to speak, to reveal, to analyze, and to construct a picture, or in this case, installation, depicting visually and spatially the challenges they wrestle with in their lives. These photographs are the result of long conversations and collaborations and can be read as a material form of psychoanalysis and therapy. Another new generation but self-taught artist also works with textile and sculpture, both of which inform his approach to the photographic material itself. This large multi-chapter work body of work investigates the male body and the notion of masculinity as a site for social and political constructs and inheritances through a process of disassembly and reassembly. It is a process-driven work, highly personal and biographical, while also incorporating and responding to both local and transnational narratives and positions. Working with local neighborhood youth and photo studios, he performs and documents the performances, cutting and weaving the pieces together later in his studio, creating these unique photo collages, each building on and evolving from one after another in series. Well known for his commercial and travel photography work, Marwan Addoui grew up surrounded by the more well-known modernist artists from the 60s. Completely self-taught, he instinctually creates images that speak to the trends and approaches of art practice, mostly painting, of the time by choosing to work abstractly on issues of form, composition, light, and texture. It may be surprising for us today to acknowledge, given where we are today, that these works were in fact exhibited and acquired in Cairo in a commercial art gallery setting in the mid-1980s. Both his compositions and methods of production are linked to what was happening at the time and have a global resonance. From a background in painting and theater design, Nabil Boutros's work is multifaceted and currently leans more towards installation, often with stinging social critique, mostly incorporating photography in some way. This work on the left, made in tandem at the beginning of the 2011 Arab Spring, directly speaks to the notion of coexistence, responding to tensions experienced at the time. His earlier works on the right take their cue from known photographers such as Paul Strand and August Saunders. Boutros would often roam the streets at night, observing and taking portraits of life in the city, its workers, its alleys, perceptible moments that reconnected him to his homeland as an Egyptian and having an Egyptian essence. Although not specifically within the arena of art photography, Yasser Elouen's work faces directly the mechanism of photography and what it means to photograph and be photographed. He has also written about photography, was a longtime educator, and amassed a large collection of historical photographs. His interest in preservation and open access to knowledge propelled him to create an archive with his Egyptian collection as a seed to ensure that it is hosted by an academic institution. With a focus on the environment and our relationship to it, and referring to photographic practices directly, Brian E. Dunn has created several bodies of work that challenge the viewer to reconsider the relationship Egyptians have with the natural world, the landscape and sites of importance. She works with real people on site over long periods of time and illustrates playfully the human position vis-a-vis ecological concerns within a cultural landscape. Although this work in particular is not photographic, it has been highly referenced. It's a highly referenced piece, and in parallel sheds light on Egyptian cinema as a major visual and cultural influence. The film is a collection of clips from known and lesser known films that use the Giza pyramids as a backdrop to dramas that play out on screen. Coming from a background in literature, her work often relies on scripts and the complexities and power relations contained within them. From a new generation of artists living abroad, Sara Salem works from two departure points, one being our relationship to our ancient ancestors, and the other dealing with grief and the deeply felt loss over the recent death of a close relative. Salem creates montages blending the ancient monuments and artifacts with portrait photographs from her recently departed grandmother from the family collection. The montages then become vehicles for reckoning with our ancestral past, compressing the past and present closer together. While alluding to documents created in colonial times, she asks the audience, a native one, to reassess how we define and engage with our pharaonic heritage from the perspective of the personal and lived experience. Continuing with the tradition of itinerant photographers and tackling other aspects of representation, Roger Anis focuses on the phenomenon of the seasonal domestic tourism on popular beaches. From a photojournalism and story-making background, Anis often spends months and years pursuing a story that he feels needs to be told. One more facet of complexity of lives and events that define this country. The work is rarely seen on journalism platforms, but can easily cross over into an art photography context because of its novelty. Another commercially successful artist coming from a background in cinema, Nermeen Hammam often combines montage and collage and mixed media to create highly aesthetic tableaus, yet depicting very hard subjects and experiences. Here at the beach and desert landscape, she creates tensions between what is perceived and what is felt, like two selves in battle and endless tension. Her use of found archival images, like other artists, allows her to re-engage with the local vernacular representation from the past and bring them to her present day commentary. Mira Kadous, a new generation of trained artists from our art background, this work engages with vernacular photographs and papers from the family collection and speaks to the question of archives and collecting what remains. By engaging the audience through postcard writing, she brings us back to the motions and mechanism that dictated a time for photographs, memory and interconnectedness, material objects that are kept. Other works by this artist try to map the situation of photographs across the city, sort of a collective collection in a way. In unexpected places where photographs persist in spite of the urban decay and passing of time, like an archaeology of photographs. So that's my last slide. And in closing, what I've presented is just a picture of what has happened and is happening regarding contemporary photography, specifically focusing on portraiture and figurative works. There are plenty of things I did not mention, such as other genres of photography like landscape and the environment, the city and urbanscape, abstraction, documentary, photojournalism, and of course, cinema. Also, other things that make the work possible, like the infrastructure of independent institutions, associations, education and training, materials and facilities and services. And I also didn't mention where we see the work. Where are the exhibitions? Who and what kind of curation is possible? And who's writing about the work? What are the galleries that show it? And other vehicles for showing the work, such as bookmaking, fairs, and other presentations. And then I didn't speak about how we define value to the work and how they're placed in festivals and events, how they're acquired by museums or are presented in the art market and auctions. And of course, I didn't talk about archives and collections and preservation, but these are all more food for thought. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Heba. That was like super rich selected curation of photography over a very long time span, and you know, also a really great and interesting emphasis on the contemporary of photography that's happening in and around Egypt or through Egypt. I wanted to start with a question about your focus on art photography. And, you know, how does Egypt's photographic culture counter the dominant Western narrative of the history of photography? And what I mean by that, in a way, is, you know, what are the local qualities of portraiture, for instance? You mentioned the image of the self in Egypt. And, you know, I'm thinking about this kind of subjective lens that is as much about a sort of psychological state as a geographical one. And I was, you know, just struck particularly by like Heba Khalifa's work, or Boutros as well, these self-portraits that he made that you showed us from 2012. So I just wonder if you could expand on that idea. What, you know, what are these kinds of idiosyncratic, particularly Egyptian qualities that we can maybe find from people who have lived in Egypt, or a diaspora, or a more transitory engagement with Egypt? You know, what are these kinds of various lenses summing up in a way, or what can we derive from them?
Well, my reading is that in order to have a position, as you say, against a dominant narrative, you need to also have references. And so all of the photographers, I've mentioned almost 30 photographers from the past and from today, all of them somehow engage with the medium in very specific ways, and each case is kind of a different starting point. So there's a huge variety of how people choose to engage with either the history or the medium or other issues. But the main problem here is that we're missing the references. So if you go into a Western historical model, you know, the words such as masters and, you know, great works are often used to describe that fabric or repertoire in a way. But here we haven't had enough scholarship really, or parallel discussions about the art movements and how photography connected to what was happening between artists in their salons and gatherings and kind of informal networks. So we need a process of documenting sort of, you know, things that I pointed out today in order to come up with a vocabulary, maybe a way of expressing verbally what's going on. Otherwise, it's really a visceral reaction, and each to his own, you know, each within their own entry point or interest. I hope that answers your question. So I guess I just want to say that we don't have a library yet. you know, and these are, some people are working on it, as I've mentioned, and there's definitely more room for more discussion. So I appreciate platforms like this also, where the information can come out, and maybe it can inspire other works.
Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting because I think last week, one thing that came out of Lucy's presentation and the discussion was that, you know, is the modernity, you know, that the role of modernity played in the photographic culture. And in a way, what you're talking about now is, like you said, references. So what I think you talked about, I think you mentioned, like you said, the word interconnectedness or something. So so what we're talking about here is that in a kind of absence or a certain void of institutional support, educational frameworks, critical frameworks, scholarship, locations, viewing spaces. So I wonder, just a kind of follow-on question from that is, you know, how do you, because you're somebody who's, if I can say, you know, has founded the Contemporary Image Collective, CIC. You've also worked in Alexandria Library, and you've got your current project, TINTERA, which are all photographic institutions or operations about working with that heritage, right? Or developing a heritage. So I just, you know, obviously you're invested in this, but I wonder if you could just tell us about what you think these kind of critical frameworks, collectives, institutional support, what they can actually do to sort of develop, you could call maybe an indigenous lens in reference to Egypt.
Well, I think it already exists. I think it just hasn't been defined so much in scholarly terms. You know, there's all of the artists that I presented are all responding in one way, either to a practice of the profession or technical advancements and evolution of the medium, because medium is also important to artists who create physical works. And you know, and then they're also responding to the city in new ways that we didn't see before. I think that, you know, over this past period of time, like you said, you know, working on institution building, and we're looking at collections and being connected with contemporary art, I see a lot of interconnectedness between the past and the present, different mediums, different entry points, you know, people entering from their own lived experience, either coming from history background, literature, art, or what have you. And so photography as a medium is their tool of expression, and within the framework and limitations of that medium, and again, the references, the local references that they manage to come by, whether it's seeing a work at a foreign museum in Europe, or seeing a contemporary photography exhibition, or visiting a collection or a library, they're getting information from in different ways, and they're making their own distillation, right? So on very personal levels, like I would be hard pressed to answer and say that there's sort of a general approach that is identifiable. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. And I mean, because you have a very much a kind of embodied knowledge of this field, right? You know, you've lived it, you've worked in it, you've produced it. So from this kind of like visceral knowledge you have of contemporary Egyptian photography, how would you frame the influences on young photographers? Like, where are those references coming from? Are they coming from within an Egyptian context, or are they coming from you know, global media photographic cultures?
Well, again, you know, the majority of contemporary artists that I presented here today are active in the art world. And so they see exhibitions and they travel. And so they are very much connected to, on a global level, with discussions on photography, and they're seeing the work that's coming out of West Africa, for example, or other parts of the so-called global South, right? And so they're seeing works also coming out of the MENA region, the Arab countries, right? I think what a big challenge is not only the references, or locating them, or assimilating those references, but it's also the tools to make the work. So why, for example, in other parts of the world, we're seeing a huge interest and big shows of contemporary works with high production values. And here in Egypt, we're still quite limited. It's still difficult to import silver gelatin papers. There's a lot of restrictions. And then we also have the evolution of, the technical aspects, this sudden jump to digital platforms, right? And so we have this whole new generation of students, and like I'm sure you have also in, that you've seen on campus, who have very little exposure or understanding of analog photography and film, and how to make a film, how you imagine as a creator, how you anticipate what your artwork will be, embedded on this filmic gelatin material and then processed in the darkroom in a variety of techniques. A lot of people are disconnected from that. That's why, there were some like Osama Said in the presentation, who were very pivotal in kind of refreshing that access and giving people knowledge, bringing that knowledge with him into the country, and periodically repeating the same workshops to a very limited group of artists in Cairo. So, there's so many different variables. There's, how do you import equipment and materials? Where do you show the work? How do you, where can you see a history of Egyptian photography rolled out for you, already prepared and digested and categorized and spoken about? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like all sorts of things colliding, right? It's like all sorts of histories and influences are all happening in have happened at different times. We're all colliding for people. We actually have a question that deals with something you just touched on there, actually, from Alex Segerman. And she says she really enjoyed your talk, but she says, can you talk about how you think the changes in photo technology from albumen to silver gelatin to digital to Photoshop to installation have impacted on photographers in Egypt?
Well, for the photography diehards, there may be a sense of loss, that we've lost the analog feel for things, but the digital platforms allow for so much more. Just to give an example, when I was working on large photographic collections on digital platforms, so you work with scanned images, you're able to really read the collection in a way that you would not be able to do manually. You can't spread out 4,000 images and have kind of an overarching view of the content and begin to analyze the collection. It would just take far too much more time. So by working digitally, I was able to come up with new information regarding the production of some of these images over a period of 40 years. So for example, the Leonard and Landrock collection, and sort of a specific image of the Arab woman that they were producing over a 40-year period of time, slightly changing in the production from lithographic to offset printing to silver gelatin prints, etc. But it was still the same image, pumped out. This is the image of the Arab woman in a commercial setting, right? So all of these technologies can either free up, possibilities for creating new works, especially in the case of installation and projection and working spatially, like the last example, Amina Kabdous example. but then you also have the other side of the pendulum where photographers are actually starting to move backwards and picking up analog cameras, learning how to load film, develop it, and starting to learn how to print. And another kind of handicap of the digital world is that whereas a lot of art photographers or older generation art photographers have a plastic sensibility. They work with materials and often mixed media. The newer generation artists are somehow disconnected from that because everything is on screen. So when it comes to print, they've lost the patience, or have to kind of rebuild a printing practice to be able to make these final prints.
Sorry. Oops, no, I'm off mute. We have another question from the audience from Amiko Stock, and she says, whoops, it's just moved. I was wondering, how did the early professional stroke commercial photographic enthusiasm translated into the development of popular photography in Egypt? Things like photo clubs, family albums, the production of early analog cameras, maybe. I don't know if such a production existed in Egypt.
Well, actually, one of the slides that I took out, that I edited out of this presentation, dealt with the camera Maya and with a contemporary photographer who built his own camera. This is a camera from the early 1900s. It was used by the beach photographers and on touristic sites, so it moves around. And what's unique about this camera is that you can actually develop, it's a paper negative producing camera, you develop inside of the camera chamber. It's complicated, but there's a video that I can share with people about the last camera operator, a camera Maya operator that we managed to film in Port Said in 2012. And he goes through the motions of creating the paper negative, developing it, and then reshooting it and creating the positive, developing it, shaking off the water and handing it to the client. So that's actually a very fascinating aspect to photographic culture in Egypt. All of the variables that you see, what people do by creating albums, making stickers, having little installations in their homes of family portraits, creating printed portraits of people who have passed, like martyrs from the revolution. Yeah, and more. And even with kind of a lot of momentum right now, I guess in the last decade, a lot of momentum towards associations and platforms that offer networking and bringing people together and sharing experiences and information on collections, preservations, bookmaking, and this kind of thing. I think that that it's quite layered and rich and in a way chaotic, like some of the earlier historical examples, how kind of garish the colors are and very kind of heavy-handed and this sort of thing. So everything exists simultaneously, all different influences, from signage to cinema to printed materials to social media.
Oops. Okay, Mark, I think you have a question.
Yeah, I had a question for you, Heba. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for your talk. This was such an image-rich presentation. It was just, it was a pleasure to take in. Your talk focused largely on studios and professional photographers, as opposed to Lucy's talk last week, which focused more on vernacular photography. Should we read class onto these differences? Or do you think that that would be a mistake?
Well, I think that people like Lucy Rizova were in positions where they were able to collect material that were coming out of private homes. right? The photographic heritage that remains in the country, I guess what I'm trying to say is that much of the work has already been collected, right? So there are archives and museums that already, and private collections that already have the majority of the material. So what remains is in private hands. And if the keepers of these collections are able to understand the value of this work, then they wouldn't be ending up in flea markets or negatives being melted down to extract silver, which still happens today. Glass negatives being broken or things just generally being thrown in the trash. So I think that there's a very rich vernacular history, but we haven't seen, we've just seen the tip of the iceberg. I know that even in my personal family and many other families, our grandparents owned cameras. And so we all have photographs and negatives and albums in closets, in cupboards, at home, but they're rarely kind of taken out. One photographer that I didn't mention in the presentation today made a short film called Ma'arafsh, I Don't Know. And basically it's a 3-minute film where it basically goes through him going through the family collection, and because so many people have departed, he no longer recognizes who they are. And so there's this disconnect then with the places and events and the important moments that were documented by these photographs. So that's also another problem, when we come to read it. And then we have to really take care of what are the internal mechanisms of the photograph. That's why it's important to know who the photographer is, right? And how they're creating the image. It's not just the agency of the sitter or the subject of the photograph. So we have to also take care a little bit when we're looking at these images.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Heba. That's fantastic. And, I think we've really covered a lot of ground here on the need for institutions, right? And something to kind of preserve, but also to create a narrative of the heritage. But I just wanted to kind of jump into a more contemporary setting and throw a question at you about, the 2011 that, so, I mean, this was a huge kind of media event, it very much reflected a lot of discussions that were happening around photographic cultures or the role of the image in technology, in society at the time. And I just wonder, in your opinion, in the last decade, has photography in a way contributed to a richer understanding of difference in Egypt?
Yes, I definitely think so. And I think there are many young photojournalists that started their careers in Tahrir Square or during that specific period of time. So it was definitely a point for inspiration that engaged people a lot. There was also archiving projects, of collecting the citizen journalism and the things that were being produced. So there's a number of projects that came out of that too. So yeah, it was very important. It was also a time where we saw Egypt on the world stage, different than the images of antiquity that we generally are used to see so much. So that was also an opportunity for us to be seen, globally, and to have a little bit more control of the images that are produced and that circulate.
Okay, I think Mark, it's over to you. All right, great. Thank you so much, Heba. You've given us a lot to think about today. Thank you to the audience for your participation and your questions. I hope that you all will return and join us next week, next Wednesday, same time, same place, at 5 p.m. for the final event in our webinar series, which will be a talk from Dr. Michelle Moyd of Indiana University. Works on the history of the Askari in Northeast Africa. Michelle has written a book about this history, and the Askari were colonial soldiers basically for the German Empire, the British Empire. You know, so many of the colonial powers had these colonial fighting for them. Actually, in some cases, against anti-colonial rebellions, and then certainly in World War II and things like that. But most of these Askari that were fighting in Tanzania for the Germans were coming either from Egypt or Sudan. The Germans had this idea that about, well, and so did the Europeans did, about these martial races. So Michelle has a series of images of these Askaris, soldiers, and their families that she's going to be talking to us about next week, which will kind of, you know, enlarge the and the social picture for us a little bit. We've been pretty focused on Egypt for the last 3 events, but this time we're going to expand the geographical range. So please, all of you, thank you so much to all of you who've been really consistent about supporting us with this webinar series thus far. We look forward to seeing you next week for Michelle Moyd, Wednesday, 5 p.m. once again. To wrap things up, thank you so much.